All right, so for the sake of transparency, we should probably say that this is the second time that we are recording this episode because of connectivity issues that were going on with Craig, the robot that we use to record these podcasts. So what you're going to be getting is a slightly rehearsed version of our commentary today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Watch No Evil. I'm Matt.
And I'm Zach.
And today we're going to be talking about the Netflix original film BirdBox, starring Sandra Bullock. So, the first thing that I want to talk about with this movie is the sensory deprivation element. One of the things that is really interesting, to me at least, is the slow rise in amount of films that include some sort of sensory deprivation aspect to them. So either blindness or the inability to see, but also the loss of hearing. So I would say that one's probably more common, but this film in particular gets connected with A Quiet Place quite a bit. And the main focus of A Quiet Place is that there are monsters that hunt by sound, and so the film has a generally quiet atmosphere, but it also includes deaf characters who are unable to hear what's going on around them. The film Hush incorporates a deaf character who is being hunted, so a little bit more realistic iteration of that. And then you have films like Don't Breathe, in which a group of thieves try to break into this older man's home, and he is blind and a trained killer, and so he turns out the lights, and then he starts to hunt them, so then they're unable to see. So I think that this movie is another addition to that sensory deprivation element, which I believe stems from people's fear of loss of sense, particularly loss of sight and loss of hearing, which are probably two of the most common fears that people have. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So hearing and sight are probably the two senses that we use most for detecting threats and analyzing those threats. So it's makes sense that they are used in this way to produce fear in the audience members, because in the case of Bird Box, you have this loss of sight where actually using your sight is the source of the danger. And as animals, humans, when threatened, when they feel threatened, they look around to see, where's this threat coming from? What does it look like? Is it really a threat? And that is really the issue that's going to cause your death in this scenario. So the sight is taken from you, but also using your sight when trying to preserve your survival is actually going to be the source of your demise in this apocalyptic scenario here.
Yeah, and I was actually thinking of this too. In these movies, it really plays to fears of isolation and alienation, particularly because of what you said. The way that we typically detect threat is through vision or through hearing. And not only that, vision and hearing are the primary ways in which we communicate with others. So it's not even just about threats. It's about being able to, talk to someone or see what they have written or view their body language and react to that. So in these situations, losing one of those senses, you're losing one of your primary means of communicating safety, being able to connect with the other people in those circumstances. And so I think that it creates a really isolating atmosphere as well. And I mean, you think about Mallory, even though she's taking care of the kids in this movie, every time that you see her with that blindfold on, there's this like lone wolf sort of approach to her character. Like, you see her and it feels very individual, even though the kids are there. And I think that that's part of the storytelling, but you get the sense of alienation from others around you. And I think that what makes this so impactful in horror movies is because it pairs a realistic fear, the loss of sight, the loss of hearing, and the feelings of alienation and isolation from others and from safety with these supernatural elements. And so you have a compounded fear that is significantly more terrifying.
Right. And I think that as applied to Mallory's character, it relates to this thing that happens really early in the movie when she's in her painting studio, and the painting that she's currently working on while she's talking to her sister, she says that painting is about people's inability to connect with each other. And then there's like a bit of a self-portrait element to it where there's a person that very much looks like Mallory in the middle of the painting with her eyes closed. So this kind of ties that inability to connect, or that kind of isolation, alienation that you were talking about, with this sense of sight and the imagery of eyes in this movie.
Yeah, so there's a real self-reflective element in that, and of course that is interesting and good foreshadowing for what's going to happen throughout the rest of the movie. I do want to bring up though, Zach, when are they going to make a scratch and sniff horror film?
Scratch and sniff.
Listen, if they can do it with the Rugrats, when the Rugrats meet the Wild Thornberrys, I think that they can absolutely achieve a scratch and sniff horror film. You know, a little thing pops up on the screen, it says number 1, you scratch number 1, and it's, I don't know, slaughterhouse viscera. You know, really, really overwhelm the senses, give a sense back to the audience.
Smell-o-vision, if you will. So you're saying kind of like A Quiet Place, but also kind of like Bird Box, instead of losing sight or hearing, you lose your sense of smell?
No, I'm saying you gain the sense of smell.
Oh, I was going to say, if you lose the sense of smell, isn't that just like having COVID? Oh, no. Is that in poor taste?
Oh, man. I mean, it's such an interesting idea to have that loss of sense, but obviously sight and hearing are the ones that are ubiquitously represented in media because they're the ones that I think people view as the most important.
They're the most universally implemented. Think of the other senses. I mean, feel is very important. Your nerve endings are very important for your survival, because you can feel pain. If you don't feel pain, let's say you're on fire or something and you can't feel that, that's a huge, huge risk. I think that would be kind of hard to implement in a film, especially in a horror film. But think about taste and smell. Those are really only used for survival in tasting poison or smelling something that's toxic, and that doesn't really produce fear like these, like losing your hearing and losing your sight. It's that's how you actually analyze danger around you as a human.
And we have no frame of reference for loss of touch. I mean, generally people either can feel sensation or they can't. It's not going to be a one or the other. And then with hearing, there are situations in real life where we may experience some sort of hearing loss in an event, or sight loss whenever it's dark and we can't see. But even in both of those, we can still generally feel things. We can actually still touch things. We're always sort of grounded, always aware of where our feet are at. And so there's not really that same frame of reference. And I think that the fact that people have experienced loss of sight, loss of hearing, even in niche situations, makes it more palpable. It makes it more realistic than losing sense of touch, losing sense of smell, especially with horror movies, because we don't need sense of smell really, but also because there's this idea that loss of smell, which we associate with colds or illnesses, is an inconvenience. It's not necessarily an overwhelming obstacle, which the other sudden loss of sense can be.
Right. It wouldn't that. The loss of that sense doesn't so much permanently rearrange how you have to live your life as much as hearing or sight. And I wonder if part of the whole this wave of sensory deprivation horror films, I wonder if some of the fear maybe comes from fear of aging and thus dying. As you grow older, your senses tend to fade, and I wonder if that has anything to do with the fear that they're trying to instill in their audience with the loss of sight and the loss of hearing.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. People have this idea that loss of sense is an inevitability. And so this movie, it pairs that inevitable loss of sense with a present feeling of danger. And so that makes it even more terrifying, ultimately, that we see them losing their ability to see, or we see them lacking the ability to hear, and we think, oh, I could be like that someday. And obviously we're not going to experience, a invisible monster that makes us want to do harm to ourselves, but we very well could experience that loss of sensation. And in doing so, you subconsciously plant that subliminal fear in your audience's mind, because we're supposed to be afraid of the monsters, but was the intention that we were afraid of the loss of sense as well?
I possibly. I think it's that compounded with the monsters, or just the situational distress of you cannot use your sense of sight, plus you're in this dangerous situation. I think it's the combination of those. It's, you've lost your sight. Okay, that's bad enough. But what if you had lost your sight and you're in this dangerous situation, which could very well, maybe not happen in this way, but it could very well happen in another way that is more realistic.
I also think that there is a commonality in all of these movies, and it's that whenever there is some sort of loss of sense, there's a lot of imagery around it. And you and I had talked about the concept of eyes and the use of eyes as a metaphor or as a reference throughout the film. And the one that you mentioned was the painting where Mallory's eyes are closed in the painting, because we're assuming that she is at the center of the Last Supper-esque painting. But did you have any other moments of sort of clarity regarding eyes and the idea of their metaphor in the film?
Well, obviously the sense of sight is very important in this film and prevalent. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about it. And it's all about the blindfolds, but also there are a lot of close-up shots of people's eyes, especially right after they see the creatures. You can see their eyes get all swirly, and they make a huge deal out of it when Mallory's sister sees the creature and she goes, "What the hell is that?" And then they zoom in on her eyes, and it's all swirly looking. Mm-hmm. And it's also Mallory being a painter. She's a visual artist. She creates these visual pieces of art that are meant to be consumed through the use of your sight and your eyes. So it kind of even furthers that idea of sight is important, especially important to her, because that's her medium.
Yeah, and I think that it's really interesting too, that concept of perceiving the creatures, because one of the things that I think is an interesting parallel as well is this idea of creation. And so I actually wanted to mention that when Gary, the evil one that is an acolyte of these creatures, is in the house, one of the things he does, he goes into the living room and he takes out all of these drawings of what the different creatures look like. And that's where you get the first implication that the creatures have multiple forms and that there are many of them. It's not one sort of thing that is steadily, quickly moving across the world, but rather it is a plethora of these creatures. All of his pictures of them, all of the charcoal drawings that he made, are portraits. They all have eyes, and some of them are Lovecraftian in nature, where they'll have like tentacles or beaks or these like bird-like aesthetics, but they all are centered around them being a human-esque looking face. And the eyes are open and white in those pictures because the rest of them are black. I think that that's a really interesting point that they make in the film, that we do actually kind of get to see what they look like, only in the most basic artistic sense, but that they see as well. and that there is an emphasis on their eyes. I think also the way that they do the effects with the eyes, it's supposed to sort of connect to Mallory's painterly nature, because it does sort of feel like there's this watercolor-y wash that covers up their eyes. And so to me that ties in as well, that there's this idea that the creatures can be drawn, they can be perceived in that form, but they cannot be viewed, and they can't be viewed in any capacity. For example, when B.D. Wong, who is the Asian actor who owns the house that they're all staying in, looks through his security cameras, he witnesses them, and they have the same impact. I wonder how much of a crossover there is then. So I have a question for you and your thoughts about this. If you looked at a photograph of one of the creatures, what would happen?
I would guess that it would still have an effect because, he saw the image of the creature through the camera, like the security camera, which was a live feed. But I would guess that, what are videos, if not just a bunch of still images put together?
Right, okay, so you think that would happen. So then my wonder is, why didn't they just take pictures and then show the pictures to the family? A much more effective way of converting them to following the acolyte ship.
Oh, you definitely found a plot hole here. Yeah, that would make sense. Maybe it's like one of those things, like in some other horror movies, like when people try to take pictures of demons, it like breaks the camera and like the picture ends up all like black or white or something, and you can't actually see the image. Maybe it's something like that.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering about that too, because then I was sort of wondering, just like, what about the creatures is the thing that causes it to happen? And actually, it gives the audience this view of these pictures of them, and in all of the pictures, the eyes are just these white, empty circles. So I actually started thinking that, metaphorically, it could be that seeing the creature's eyes is actually the thing that causes it to happen, for that sort of invasion of the mind, an eye-to-eye contact. And I think that would be a really interesting telling of this story as well, that it has to be that, like, sight-to-sight transmission,
right.
that element of communication.
Right. And in, like, creature invasion movies like this, normally you'd think of, like, these are some pretty big creatures. They're messing stuff up. This just occurred to me. Like, what if they're really small? They're like tiny little things. They're like, they're just tiny little creatures, and just seeing them, because really they don't have to be big to be a threat, because it's all about seeing them and interacting with them in a visual way. So they really have to have size on their side. It could be, maybe they're actually birds. They're like bird-like creatures, like you mentioned earlier, with that Lovecraftian kind of imagery that Gary draws them with. What if they're like tiny little things?
Yeah, there's something about the creatures, and for me at least, it's the way in which they move the environment around them, because this movie has so much in common with The Happening. It's this unforeseen element that causes people to kill themselves, and the thing that separates them is, in The Happening, it's a biological defense system of the environment, where it's the trees and the flowers are causing this thing to happen, and it's this neurotoxin that's riding on the wind, and the acting's terrible. And in this movie, it's an actual physical creature that is moving through the world, and the gaze upon it is what causes madness to occur. And in both of those things, the sign that they are near, at least for the audience, besides the bird box, is that wind rushing, and you see the rustling of the environment around it. So, one, birds can create wind, so maybe it's a whole swarm of birds, or maybe it's a bird-like creature, which I'm going to touch on later, obviously. And two, the other thing that I was thinking about them were that they had to be at least substantial because of this, like, corporeal weight that they give to them in their surrounding environment. And it's particularly in the scene where Mallory is calling to Girl to try and bring her back. there is this sort of like gravitas that they're trying to give the creature in those scenes that, this is going to sound stupid. When I first watched the movie, I thought it was like a dinosaur.
Well, they do have, so I'm going back on like what if they're tiny thing, because they do have like where a shadow will kind of like cross over, and they're pretty big shadows. So
yeah,
I'm gonna backtrack on that. But they definitely, I mean, like with the whole wind and like the leaves rustling up kind of idea, I don't think it'd be out of the question for them to have wings. So plus they move around pretty fast.
All right, so I gotta ask, have you seen the special effects artist's realization of what the BirdBox creature looks like?
Oh, no, I haven't.
Yeah, so on Instagram, the creator, or one of the people working on the BirdBox film, released what the creature would look like to Mallory. And let me tell you, it's not great. And they filmed scenes with it, but they ended up cutting those scenes because it looks stupid.
I just Googled BirdBox creature, and this like
it's the baby
old
thing.
man looking alien thing. Yeah, it looks like a baby crossed with an old man, but also like a bit alien looking.
Yep, that's it.
Oh, I'm so glad they didn't add any images of this.
Yeah, they said that they filmed it and it looked silly, it looked comical. And the whole point of it was supposed to be sort of a nightmarish representation of Mallory's fear of motherhood. And I think that an addition of that would have been sort of antithetical to the way that they treat the rest of the movie, especially because it's not always about fear in the actual film. And I think about Douglas's wife, Douglas being the cantankerous old man, whose wife runs into the street to help Mallory. Douglas's wife sees one of the creatures and thinks that it's her mom, and she's drawn to that image, and that's what causes her to commit suicide. And they reference the creatures being so beautiful, which is opposite to the way that they sort of portray this like grotesqueness, that grotesque image that the ones who have devolved into madness draw. Specifically Gary, all of those monsters have that Lovecraftian element to it. And so, if I may, I would like to transition into my theory about the creatures. So, I came up with this theory that the creatures are actually the biblical representations of angels, as described in Ezekiel and as described in Leviticus. And the supermarket guy, whose name I keep forgetting. Charlie always talks about how they are demons, or the representations of demons from different cultures, because there are demons in every type of culture. But one of the things about the biblical representation of angels is that when you look upon the form of an angel, you as a human are unable to comprehend what you see, and so your mind goes to the furthest reaches of the imagination. And so they're called beautiful. They call the creatures in the film beautiful. And for example, Douglas's wife sees her mother, and they all get very sad before they end up dying. And so I was thinking that what they are seeing is the angels at the apocalypse, and that the representation of, the rapture, them being taken to God to see God, the ones that are good, is them killing themselves. And that's how they are getting to, leave the mortal plane. And that's what the whole point of the rapture is. And then the ones who are mad are those that are getting left behind.
I like that reading of the creatures. I think that makes sense, like we discussed earlier, with like the leaves rustling and all that. I think that it's a flying creature for sure, and angels are almost always depicted with having wings. And with Lydia, Douglas's wife, saying, "Mom, please don't go," to one of the creatures, like that makes sense. Angels sometimes are depicted as being, people who have died and then are, what are angels? Are they people who have died and then have gone to heaven? Or what are they in a biblical sense?
I think that it's a mix, because, there's this idea that you become an angel after you pass on. But there are multiple types of angels. There's actually a hierarchy of angels. And there are different levels. And so there are one that are divine creations, just as there are, demons who are of divine, though, satanic origin. And then there are, those that are people that have passed on. And so the seraphim is an angel with 6 wings that constantly covers its form so that it cannot be perceived by humans. And then there are cherubs, which are in fact not the representation of the tiny baby angel that we see depicted in Renaissance paintings, but instead the Ezekiel description of cherubs is that they are these creatures with 6 wings, and they have 4 heads, one of which is human, on an animal body, and they are surrounded by these spinning cogs and wheels.
Oh my.
And there are depictions of angels that have many, many eyes. From many descriptions of angels, they're like abomination. They are horrifying looking at, and it's because they're at the end of the imagination. We cannot perceive what they look like, so they become this conglomerate of lots of different representative elements. And so I think that explains what people are seeing, and the fact that the angels can fly and they have wings, and they have the gravitas of size and of movement. That would be the reason that they cause so much environmental disruption around them.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting interpretation, that it's the viewing of an angel of the end of times that results in people taking their own life, and then in doing so they're part of the rapture. And it's because we see people that aren't great people, such as Gary or the other from the there are some that were qualified as insane beforehand. They are the ones that are sort of stuck, staying on Earth, and they are the ones that have to help others along in moving on, and that's why they try and force people to see. Because if you think about everybody in the film that sees one of the creatures, they're all people that are good. They are pure people. For example, Olympia, or Mallory's sister, and Tom. And, you think about the people who died in the film. For example, Douglas, who didn't see the creature, he's killed separately, but Douglas is portrayed as this not-so-great person. Would, if he had seen the angel, gone crazy, or would he have killed himself? And I think that by having Gary kill him, it sort of leaves that mystery.
Right, and I think that kind of, it also is an out for the writers on how to kind of judge his character. Because at the end of the day, it's that's what's happening here, is it's judgment. That's, who gets to be raptured and who gets left behind. Like these psych patients who Gary said they wanted to see these creatures, and they wanted to see what one of the guys describes as the truth. Like the guy on the river who Mallory ends up killing with the machete. He said he's trying to get them to take their blindfolds off. He says, "I've seen the truth. You've got to take your blindfolds off so you can see it too, and it's beautiful," and all this stuff.
Have you seen the movie Legion?
No, I haven't.
Legion is another horror movie, and it's about the angel Gabriel comes to this abandoned desert diner because there's a woman who is pregnant and her husband ran off, and it's supposed to be that her child is the next coming of Christ. And they are trying to God is trying to cleanse the world, and he sends his angels to come and to, end the world. And the angels in that movie are terrifying. They're these monsters with extraordinary crazy long limbs, and their jaws drop to the floor, and they look like demons. They're treated like demons, but they are called angels. And it's sort of that idea that true angels are kind of horrifying. They are terrifying to perceive, and also what it means to see one on Earth.
Right. It's kind of like what you were talking about earlier, how they're on the edge, or people have to kind of reach the edge of their imaginations to even perceive what they're seeing when they look at an angel. It's kind of like the idea of when you try to think of a color that you've never seen before. Right. And it's just impossible. So it like you said earlier, it's understandable that it might drive someone to, kill themselves because they've just kind of lost their mind to some degree.
Yeah, and I think that in the case of this movie, that's a really interesting and supported interpretation. I think that there is support for it. I think that the evidence of the film sort of suggests it, and that's, of course, if you are sort of ignoring the, like, crazy special effects monsters that they made for Mallory, the old man baby on the snake body, which, I mean, that could just be a biblical representation of a cherub, so who knows, but I think that it's not about them seeing their fears, and the whole thing was, oh, you know, they're seeing their fear, and that's what's causing them to do this. But then, when you see something that causes you to be frightened, I don't think that you get sad. And that was the thing with Jess, Mallory's sister, was when she saw the creature, she was overcome by this, like, sadness. And I would say that, you know, it's not a negative emotion. Sadness isn't really a negative emotion. It's a cathartic emotion. And so that's why I think that demons wouldn't be, you know, correct in this opinion. And that's why I think that angels are more supported. And then it also, you know, goes into this idea of the rapture. And when they get to the school for the blind at the end, all that they have boy and they have girl who are finally given names. And it's sort of this, like, overgrown, like, paradise in the middle of this, like, desolate dystopian wasteland around them, and that's representative of the Garden of Eden. And so that's why I think that it parallels really well through a biblical lens of like an earthly cleansing.
Right, yeah, and something I wanted to point out with the whole cleansing bit is, like, you know, the world around that school for the blind is all basically a wasteland at that point of, like, being 5 years after the creatures invade or just become present. And something I noticed when they got near to that school for the blind, where they start hearing the bird noises, is that there had been no other wildlife noises when they're out in, you know, along the river, or, you know, just even in the house earlier. They've got kind of like their camp out there, and there are no wildlife noises at all until, or aside from the birds that they have in the box, but also the birds at the end. There's only the ambient nature sounds, like, you know, the wind and the rushing water and all that stuff. So it kind of makes you wonder if that have these creatures or angels or whatever you want to interpret them as, have they also killed all the animals around?
I would say, yeah, I think that they did. I think that they have. I think that it's actually fairly reasonable to think that they might have done that because of the birds being a sign that the creatures are near.
Right, and something that occurred to me with the whole bird thing is that, and this kind of goes along with what we were talking about earlier with sight, is that birds can see in the UV spectrum. And I don't know if they're supposed to be able to see the creatures or not, but it might make sense that if they're invisible to the human eye, or at least invisible to the viewer's eye, then birds might be able to see them and then warn the humans about it by kind of freaking out. And maybe if we're to go with this angel interpretation, which I really like, maybe it's that they cannot be seen unless they present themselves to whoever is looking around.
I'm coming up with this idea that they are angels, but ultimately that's just an interpretation. That's just a way that it could be read. There's no way to know if that was the intention, because we don't have an artistic intention from the authors. But I think that it makes sense. And so if other people have a differing opinion about what the creatures could be or represent, they can let us know, Zach. How can they let us know?
Oh, they can let us know through our email address. Our email, if you would like to tell Matt about how he is wrong about angels or anything else, our email is watchnoevilpodcast@gmail.com. And you might get a shout out if you correct us hard enough.
Yeah.
And I think the character Charlie might disagree with you, because he's talking about his novel that he's working on that has a lot of parallels to what's actually happening in the plot of the movie. And he says that, in his research that he's done to the internet for his novel, that he's found that this kind of, the creatures that work through these kinds of means are usually entities that take on the form of your greatest fear or your greatest loss. And I think that when Lydia, Douglas's wife, says, "Mom, please don't go," that's kind of like, that's her greatest loss, is when her mom passed away. So that, I guess, drove her to her suicide. I'm not really sure. And then with the greatest fear, that could possibly take us to this theme of motherhood, because I think that this film is more about Mallory becoming a mother than actually, surviving this apocalyptic attack kind of thing. Because at the beginning of all this, she's looking at this adoption pamphlet, and she's in like the hospital bathroom. She's looking at this adoption pamphlet, and you can tell that she's considering putting her unborn baby up for adoption. She's kind of like considering that. And then all this stuff starts happening with the creatures causing people to kill themselves. And so it's kind of interpreted in that she's kind of like afraid to become a mother, or at least apprehensive about becoming a mother, because when she's getting the ultrasound, she's like meeting with her doctor and her sister's there. Then her sister says, what's that line about? Oh, she says that Mallory lives by kind of the mantra of, if you ignore something, it just goes away. And so that kind of implies that she's apprehensive about keeping the baby and actually raising it to be her own child. And then also there are a lot of kind of metaphorical moments throughout the plot of the movie that kind of show this progression of Mallory becoming a mother. Like with the blindfolds, I kind of read into that as she's blindly navigating her way to becoming a mother and like learning how to parent and take care of a child. And the creatures not only represent the fear of causing people to end their lives and cause this chaos in the world, but they can also represent the fear that Mallory has about becoming a mother and becoming responsible for the safety of another person, which is then compounded by the fact that they cause people to want to end their lives. So she's going to have to not only protect her children as she normally would in a normal world, but also protect them from this overwhelming threat in the world. And then I interpreted Olympia to serve as kind of like a preparatory device for Mallory learning how to care for like this kind of naive, childlike, innocent person.
It's interesting that a lot of people criticized Mallory's character in this movie. I mean, a lot of people said that she's this, cold, stoic, bad person. A lot of people really make her out to be a villain, but she makes it really clear that her whole goal for the children, for herself, for everyone around her is survival.
Right, and these are 5-year-old children, maybe 6 at this point. And I'm sorry if you've ever dealt with a child of that age, like there are only a couple of things that they will really respond to when it comes to listening to directions to a T. Children of that age are generally not great at following instructions because they're still exploring the world and figuring out how things work. But she uses fear and that intensity when she talks to them. She's telling them, you will die if you don't listen to everything I'm saying. And I feel like that's a really realistic way, and that really scaring these kids into following instructions is really like her survival tactic for them. Really the only other way to get them to listen is if she was like, I can give you a piece of candy or something if you do this for kids of that age.
Yeah, I mean, the typical parenting solution is just like, don't reach on top of the stove or you might get burned. And, you say it really nicely and you say it with that sing-songy voice, and then they do it and they get burned, and it's just like, you learned by doing, you got burned and now you won't do it again. And in this case, it's like, if you take off your blindfold, you die and you don't get a second chance to redo it. And so it's a different situation. Her parenting style in this is of necessity. It is not her being a bad parent. It is because they have no other choice.
Right.
And she does it. I mean, it is commendable that she is able to keep those kids alive up to that point.
Yeah, you're not allowed to judge Mallory's parenting until you've been through a sight creature apocalypse. In the way that she plans and is logical about the survival, and that might make her seem kind of cold. And she does seem kind of cold towards Olympia when she first appears, and there's that whole scene of where Olympia wants to sleep next to her because she read somewhere that pregnant women should sleep next to someone so that the baby feels less isolated or something like that. And then Mallory kind of like walks away from Olympia while she's like trying to have this moment, and that might make her seem kind of cold, but
it's her fear of loss. She has this idea that if she gets close to someone, if she's kind to them, they're going to leave her. And that's set up because of the way that her baby's father left her at the beginning.
Right. And they do attribute, I remember now, they do attribute some of it to her past and how her father, she talks a lot about her father and how he was kind of this mentality of where she kind of has to just take care of herself, and he just kind of parented from afar.
And there's sort of this idea that Olympia is not only that pure, innocent person that Mallory is mothering, but she's also a foil to who Mallory is, which is pragmatic. Mallory is pragmatic. She's utilitarian. Everything about it has to have meaning for survival, whereas Olympia represents optimism and the optimistic, hopeful side. And when Mallory sees how hopefulness gets Olympia killed, she shuts that down. And then once they finally achieve the safety of the school for the blind, then she is able to allow herself hope, which is recognized by her letting the birds out of the box to go fly around with the others, and by her finally giving Tom and Olympia their names, which are the names of boy and girl.
Right. And that's, I mean, the fact that she calls them boy and girl from the beginning for the first 5 years of their life are just another instance of her avoiding getting attached out of pragmatism. Like you mentioned earlier with Olympia, she tries not to get attached to Olympia and tries to stay somewhat distant. And, you know, when you become a parent, it's somewhat hard to be distant from your children, but she's pretty much done that as much as possible by avoiding actually calling them names.
Yeah, and then when she does finally give them their names, it's that symbol of hope and of, you know, conclusion that they have finally reached a point of happiness or of safety where they can now finally express a desire to live. Mallory allows herself to be optimistic again.
Right, and them being named at the School for the Blind kind of supports this idea that I had of the process of them traveling down the river is almost like labor, or, you know, the rapids have this water imagery to it, which are many times likened, or not likened, but related to birth and the childbirth process. And when they get to the School for the Blind, they receive their names. So it's kind of like they have been born. And now, you know, when Tom was talking about how they should go to this community at the school, they would be allowing themselves to finally live life instead of just hiding. So it's kind of like their lives are beginning. And also when they leave the relative safety of their camp to then go to the school and go down the river, it's almost like they're starting to leave the womb, which is this idea of kind of relative safety and a source of, you know, they know they have sustenance there, but it's not going to last forever. And
I think that it should be noted that Sandra Bullock carries the heck out of this film.
It should definitely be noted. She does. I mean, she's the main character. Top billed
She's the
cast.
main character, but also she's great in the acting because she is so much more believable than I think that most actors would have been in her position, because you get the coldness, you get the stoicism, but you also get sort of the hopefulness and the light in her, and she's such a capable actor. I think that this was really a perfect role for her to sort of flex the multitude of acting talents that she has. And obviously we've seen her do great work in The Blind Side, where she was a great dramatic actor, While You Were Sleeping, where she was, you know, the romantic comedy lead, and Miss Congeniality, which is sort of the mix of that cold stoicism and that humorousness. She's kind of a nerd. I think that this really was an opportunity for her to come through and shine as an actress, and she helped make the movie feel good.
Right, and she does just such a good job in those moments of kind of fight or flight, where in horror movies a lot of times, in movies like this, where it's kind of the survival kind of plot, where you'll have the character does something that no one would ever do logically. And of course, then the character gets killed or whatever, gets got by whatever entity that's attacking. And she does the logical things. And she really, like, as an actress, I think Sandra Bullock really pulls it off with her expression and just the way she goes about doing those actions. But, you know, she does such a good job. But did you know that she actually passed up this film? She actually said no when they asked her to play in this film.
Well, it was good that she changed her mind.
Yeah. I think they did ask someone else after they asked her, and that person also said no, and they kind of went back, and I think they groveled a little bit, and I still don't remember what what movie it was what horror movie she had been in the 90s, but she did not like being in horror movies because of that experience. So
While you were sleeping.
it was not that one. I can't remember which one it was.
I mean, consider it. I think that there's another Netflix original movie with the girl that played London Tipton on Netflix that's about essentially while you were sleeping, which is person goes into coma, wakes up, and this other person is pretending to be their fiance. There's literally a horror movie with the same plot.
I think what's that? Do you remember what the name is?
I don't remember what the name of it is.
I think I've seen that one.
But it's the same plot of while you were sleeping.
It's also like based off of like an X-Files episode.
Yeah. Sandra Bullock was in Premonition.
Yeah, I think okay. I think that was the one. But anyways, that one.
Premonition or Murder by Numbers.
Yeah, whichever one it was, she didn't exactly enjoy being a part of whichever horror thriller movie, so she was apprehensive about taking this one on, but I think she did a great job, like you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, she really has a long history of really great comedic roles and sort of that romantic comedy style. And then I remember when she did The Blind Side, and people were, no pun intended, blindsided by how great her dramatic acting was. And so I think that this was a perfect role for her. I don't know if she'll, come back for the sequel. I kind of hope that she doesn't, only because I think that the conclusion to her story was so well wrapped up in the movie that it would feel disappointing for them to try and do more character development with her.
So Sandra Bullock did specifically request that Sarah Paulson play her sister in this. This was because they filmed Ocean's 8 together. Ocean's 8 and Bird Box both came out in 2018. And I think Ocean's 8 started filming shortly before they finished up casting for this film. So
And for many insecure men in America, Ocean's 8 with Sandra Bullock and Sarah Paulson was a scarier horror movie.
Right. The all-female cast for an Ocean's franchise film. Yes, that angered a lot of people. All right. Do you want to explain what the BirdBox challenge is?
All right. So the BirdBox challenge was a bunch of influencers on YouTube who decided to blindfold themselves while doing everyday tasks like hunting or driving their car down a major thoroughfare. And it was incredibly stupid, but it was actually started with, I think, Twitch streamers in Australia as this thing that actually was supported by Netflix early on. But over time, the influencer culture of YouTube sort of came in and decided that they were going to take it a step further and do it really dangerously. And Netflix had to come out and be like, hey, stop doing this because we don't want to eventually be implicated in some sort of, lawsuit because you did something dangerous and used the BirdBox franchise name as your reasoning.
Right. It's Netflix's name is behind the BirdBox name as well. So of course, those influencers always have to up the ante on things. So anything else?
I think that's good. You want to
Okay.
wrap it up?
Sure, but first I forgot to do this originally, but I just want to make a shout out to my sister and her husband, Lisi and Troy, because they have prepared a actual recorded instrumental version of our theme song. And you'll probably hear this for the first time at the beginning of this episode and probably when we end shortly here. So I just want to shout out to them and thank them for preparing that for us.
Thanks, PC. Thanks, Troy.
Thank you. So this has been Watch No Evil, BirdBox edition. This is Zach.
And this is Matt.
And we'll catch you with another episode next week.